morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the working group that will discuss calculating the native load needs and available transfer capability, or ATC, as part of our transmission service and market scheduling priorities initiative. Michelle, if you could please advance to the next slide. I'm joined today by our presenter, who will be going through the CAISO deck, and our lead for this effort, Milos Botnich from our policy group. I'm also joined here today by Tracy Hilman. Thank you, Tyrone, for your time today, from PG&E, who will be presenting on behalf of the California LSEs. And thanks for everyone's input for that. We will be taking questions today. Throughout, please raise your hand virtually by pressing the raise hand icon. And once you no longer need to comment, we ask that you please be sure to lower your hand so that we can see that you don't have anything else in the queue. If you happen to dial in separately, though, by phone, then you need to push #2 to enter the queue. And we prefer verbal questions, although if you see anything in the chat, we'll be sure to verbalize those as well. And we'll start with questions from our panel today. So thank you, of course, as well for our panelists for joining us today. And then we'll move on to questions from the attendees. And as most are familiar, this call, as most of our calls and webinars, are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to the recordings after the meetings. The recordings will be available publicly on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meeting. And of course, we please request that the recording and any related transcriptions not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And with that, I'll hand it over to Milos.
Thank you, Jimmy, and good morning, everyone. And welcome to another working group meeting. Maybe we can move on to the next slide for just a second to outline where we've been. So this is working group 1. We started back in early or mid-November, and we had presentations from Idaho Power, Salt River Project, as well as the Bonneville Power Administration regarding their practices. How do they calculate different ATC components, including how do they derive native load needs, as well as some of the other components such as the capacity benefit margin, transmission reliability margin. What are the different assumptions and ultimately uses for those different components? And we certainly appreciated those presentations and the time that those entities took to put that together and share it with us, and I think we learned a lot. Today, the Joint California Load Serving Entities will be sharing a presentation where they share some ideas and concepts for us to consider. So I encourage everybody to ask questions. I hope that we have a robust discussion today on how ultimately this concept of calculating ATC native load needs and different components of the ATC methodology could ultimately apply in the California ISO situation, and how we could derive those native load needs and the different components of the methodology. So we certainly appreciate Tyrone and the Joint California LSEs sharing the presentation today. Let's go to the next slide. Just some working group logistics. We covered these, I think, at every meeting. Usually Christina covered those, but today, these discussions are open to all stakeholders, and there'll be opportunities to ask questions both from the panelists as well as from the participants. And like Jimmy said, these will be recorded, and the presentation today from the California LSEs is posted on our website, and you can see the link there. Before we jump in, I'll note as well that we're working on scheduling now that we're winding working group 1 down. We're working on scheduling working group 2 and 3, and you should see market notices in the early part of next week announcing some dates for those working groups, likely starting in the January timeframe. We're looking to coordinate with the core participants to see if there's any ability to start some of these in the next couple of weeks. But in light of the holidays, I think we're probably going to start in the early January timeframe for those working groups 2 and 3. I'll also note that later today, we will also be posting the phase 1 proposal as part of this initiative. So these working groups are focused on that longer term framework, part of phase 2 of the initiative, and the development of a transmission reservation process for establishing market scheduling priorities. But we will be posting the phase 1 proposal today, and may even be during this meeting. We're working on finalizing the market notice and getting that out. Okay, before I turn it over to Tyrone, just want to pause. Are there any questions? Okay, I don't think I see any hands raised.
No, I do not see any hands raised in the queue. I am double checking. As a reminder, ladies and gentlemen, the raise hand icon is located right above the chat box. So if you have a question, please be sure to click on that if you are on the WebEx audio. If you are dialed in, as Jimmy indicated earlier, via regular telephone, #2 will also get you into the question queue.
Okay, I don't see any questions, and there's also going to be an opportunity at the end as well to ask any questions to the extent anybody thinks of anything that may come up. But let me then turn it over to Tyrone and again express our gratitude on behalf of the ISO to Tyrone and the California LSEs for taking the time to present and put together a presentation. We certainly appreciate it, and we encourage questions throughout this discussion. I know the ISO may have a few, but we certainly appreciate you taking the time. Thank you, Tyrone. Okay, I think we can move on to Tyrone's slide now, maybe to the next slide, or the slide deck. There we go.
Great. Milos, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you okay.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Happy Friday to everyone. And hello, my name is Tyrone Hilman. I'm the manager of the FERC and ISO policy team here at PG&E. I've been an employee at PG&E for just over 15 years. And before I get started, one of the things I thought I'd just encourage folks, considering the length of today's meeting, knowing that we're all working virtually, I'd encourage you that probably about 30 minutes in or so to get up and maybe move around a little bit. It's especially as we're all in this virtual environment. And so with that being said, I'd also like to appreciate and thank the ISO as well as his staff for organizing these working group meetings to facilitate the exchanging not only of ideas, but also mutual learnings for this very important initiative. And I'd also like to express my appreciation and thanks to my esteemed colleagues from across the various California entities who've not only provided critical input to this presentation, but have really offered some ideas that I think are especially important for this particular topic. So as we consider today's presentation on native load needs and the ATC calculation, it's really, as Milos mentioned earlier, to facilitate a discussion on some of the critical elements that we believe will be important features within this particular process. And as this process is being developed recognizing that the transmission provider has a responsibility to reliably meet its native load as well as provide open access without compromising its reliability objectives. So with that being said, let's go ahead and go to slide number 2. All right. So again, as I mentioned before, today's presentation is looking to explore some of the ideas that really aren't etched in stone, and they are really being outlined for discussion purposes only. These ideas, we believe, can serve as inputs to the overall evaluation process in the future that's intended to ensure the reliability needs are being met under the various, scenarios, whether that's gen, transmission, or load scenarios. So with that being said, this is really outlining, again, some of those ideas. We're willing and open to additional ideas. And again, these are just some of the preliminary thoughts of the joint LSEs. And again, I can't say enough my appreciation to our fellow partners who helped us to put this presentation together. Next slide, please. So one of the things we thought would be really helpful is just to kind of share what we believe are some of our learnings from the various work group presentations. And now that I'm actually presenting, it was really interesting while looking at the material from Idaho, Vistra, BPA, Salt River, so on and so forth, and really just making sure that I had at least a cursory understanding of the information that was presented. But one of the things that we especially took away is that there is not only variety, but I might even say flexibility and diversity among the various presenters on how the various entities have elected to meet their unique balancing area needs. And this includes what I would call maybe distinct assumptions in transmission assumptions, generation, load. We saw some that had 1 in 20, 1 in 5, 1 in 2. And it also seemed, the other thing to note as well, again, about the transmission topology, I think in one presentation we saw that there were some IRP assumptions in order for that future outlook for some of the longer term. And but the other thing that we also saw is that there seemed to be a clear understanding that the tariff would include the high level principles, while the BPM will get into the minutia and the details of the assumptions that were up to the BAA's discretion. And but all of these things were in support of the BAA ensuring its reliability while allowing open access, the open access policy without compromising its own BAA reliability. So those are just some of the things that we observed from the various presentations. Again, noting the flexibility and the diversity among the various needs and how those needs were being met uniquely for each BAA. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a slide that I actually, I like this particular slide because it provides a visual depiction of curtailment and reservation. Now, the one thing I should probably warn is that normally when you begin to put boxes together and create a visual depiction of any particular potential process, there's obviously, it's not perfect, but it helps to, in my mind, to orientate ourselves to the reservation priority. This also helps to highlight some of the things I believe that Milos noted regarding Working Group 2, that there's some additional details that need to be worked out as specifically as it relates to the firm service product. But what this is really intended to do is that it's designed to display the transmission capacity that is reserved for the reliable service of native load. And then that's followed by additional products or the remaining products that can be used for transmission service. So it shows also the curtailment priority from highest to lowest, starting with the existing transmission contracts up at the top from a priority standpoint, down to the lowest curtailment priority, and then moving from left to right as it relates to the reservation priority in order to ensure reliability is being met by that particular BAA. So I like this particular slide because it helps to, in my mind, to organize and it just provides a visual depiction of what we're thinking about for this particular process. All right, let's see, where are we? We're on slide 4. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is what we're calling the transmission allocation process. Nothing really, I would say, that should be shocking here. This is simply the available transmission capability calculation. It's taken into account the total transfer capability, subtracting out the existing transmission commitments or contracts, and then it's also subtracting out the capacity benefit margin and the transmission reliability margin. As we know, the capacity benefit margin is for emergencies, and I believe the transmission reliability margin is specifically for uncertainties as it relates to this particular calculation. And one of the things that we've kind of highlighted here as well is that in the existing transmission commitments, it also denotes the transmission capacity that will be reserved for meeting the native load commitment, as well as taking into account the existing firm transmission service or existing firm service. And again, that goes to that firm product that will be evaluated in, I believe, in Working Group 2, and then the existing transmission contracts, the ETCs and the TORs. So again, I don't think there's anything that's controversial here, but it's just kind of highlighting and organizing us around this ATC calculation. Let's see. Next slide, please. All right, so long-term transmission allocation process. Now, one of the things you should note between this slide and the final slide is that you're going to see a lot of similarity between what we're describing as the long-term allocation process and the short-term process. As it relates to any process, I think the assumptions that are baked into them or are included within them are critically important to the overall outcomes. And so as we noted before, and this is something I think even with not only the PG&E observed, but all the joint LSCs, again, that each had various forecasts. So the long-term allocation process should have this forecast that not only takes into account uncertainty, but also load growth, and as well as some of the other goals. The other thing to note is the resource plans. And so one of the things I think that will also be important when you begin to talk about some of the future assumptions as it relates to reserving transmission capability or capacity is what are some of the generation assumptions. And so that could, the ISO could potentially leverage some of the IRP plans from the CPUC, and then obviously the transmission assumptions. And the transmission assumptions not only includes known outages, but also planned upgrades that have already been approved to be included in those assumptions, as well as ensuring that the ISO is accounting for internal deliverability for resources that have already obtained that particular status. That in essence will go into that long-term study. Then it would identify the amount of transmission that needs to be reserved for native load. And again, this is taking into account path interactions as well as interactions with the internal deliverability, taking into account the appropriate load forecasts, the gen dispatch assumptions, whether that's for hydro, for solar, wind, so on and so forth. And then from that, you will then identify the amount of transmission that is needed to be reserved in order to ensure reliability for the BAA. And I think one of the other things that we noted is, and again, this is taking into account the variety and the flexibility and the diversity that we've seen from some of the other presentations. We noted that the Idaho Power has a way of also accounting for deficiencies to ensure that there's additional capacity that could be reserved on some of the interties. And so there's a one idea that that we're putting out there potentially for consideration is at maybe potentially at some of the major hubs. And again, this is all intended to ensure reliability for the ISO's BAA. So with that being said, I'm going to pause because I haven't taken a breath or drank any water just yet, and see if there's any questions.
All right. I do not see any questions in queue currently.
Okay.
This is Milos. Michelle, if you wouldn't mind maybe just, noting for folks how they can reminding people how they can ask a question.
Sure, absolutely. So, ladies and gentlemen, as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question via WebEx audio, please click the raise hand icon, which is located on your WebEx screen. It's above the chat panel to the right. This will place you in the question queue, okay? If you are connected to today's meeting via phone audio, please dial #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue.
Okay, and this is Milos, and I think I see a question from Kathleen. Kathleen, I think you have your hand up from the panelist list. I think you can go ahead.
That's great. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I'm largely giving Tyrone a chance to drink something, although Milos, you were doing a great job providing that service as well. But I do have a question, and so I'll give a little bit more of a break. I think this is a helpful visualization. I think the visualizations are helpful. I think that, one maybe ask I'd have for the California, for the LSEs is to consider if they would you be open to sharing the PowerPoint version of this so that other stakeholders can maybe provide, using the same kind of visual framework, but expand on or suggest adjustments that might be kind of more, if there is something that would be more in line with what we're thinking, and flip that back to you so that we're using the same kind of, framework for thinking through this?
Absolutely.
I think that would be really helpful. Yeah, I think that would be really helpful. And I'll just share one thing that I'd like to try to think through on this slide is, for us, we see native load as something slightly different than the network, the NITS, which I think they're kind of being combined here when you're referring to native load. So I'd like to think through kind of what you're putting on the table here under the lens of separating them. And yeah, the deck would be helpful for me to kind of work through that.
Absolutely. That sounds
Great.
good. I will warn you in advance, my clip art skills are not great. So I'll be leaning on my team to make sure that you get the appropriate deck. But absolutely, I think we could do that. Yes.
Thanks, Tyrone. I think that'd be helpful. Appreciate it.
No problem. Yep.
All right. I am looking to see if there are any questions in queue, and there currently are no questions in queue. As a reminder, ladies and gentlemen, to enter the question queue via WebEx audio, please press the raise hand icon, which is located above your chat box to enter the question queue. If you are connected via regular audio, please press #2 to enter the question queue. All right. I do not see any questions in queue.
Sounds good. Should I continue, Milos?
Go ahead. Yeah, thank you.
Sounds good. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Now, I will say, I do want to make sure that I want to pause, not just on this slide, but we are getting close to the end. So if there are some other questions as folks are reflecting, feel free, because again, this is my second to last slide. And the objective that we have with this presentation, again, was to share what we believe are some important features within a process that needs to be developed by the ISO. And we think that these are critically important to ensuring that reliability is being met by its for its native load. So with that being said, we're looking at two of the components, CBM and TRM. And as I mentioned before, my understanding of CBM is that CBM is traditionally used for emergencies, and then TRM is used for load uncertainties, or just say uncertainties. And one of the things that we think would be an important part of this process is for the ISO to consider whether or not it should modify its current methodologies and present practices to utilize this as a part of their calculation. And this is taking into account what what we've seen some of the other entities are presently doing as it relates to the CBM. And again, all with the objective of ensuring that we are meeting the reliability for the transmission system as well as for native load. So one of the things that we noted, again, I think we mentioned a little bit earlier, as it relates to CBM, one idea is to consider reservation on particular paths that have access to some of the trading hubs. So that's either at Mid-C or at Palo Verde. And then again, looking at the transmission reserve margin, again, looking at potentially modifying the present practices to include some reservation on certain paths. Again, with the objective of ensuring reliability for the ISO's native load. And then let's go to the last slide, because again, it's a little bit next slide, please. I'm sorry. Thank you. So as I mentioned before, this slide is taking what we talked about as it relates to the long term, and now it's looking at it from a short term perspective. And so when we think of long term, we're thinking of I think more than 1 year annual. But then once you start thinking of short term, now you're talking about monthly, possibly weekly, maybe even daily. And in that, I think what's going to be critically important again is the load forecast. Again, these are very important assumptions. So what's the forecast assumptions that you're including for month ahead or week ahead, so on and so forth. The other thing to consider is the resource plans. And when we say resource plans, I think sometimes it's many might say, well, can't you just use the RA, the monthly RA showings? Well, the one thing to take into consideration, even with resource plans and the assumptions with that, is that the monthly RA showings may not show or may not be completely representative of the generation that's needed in order to meet reliability. And so I think also some of the resources in the ISO service territory, such as RMR, resource reliability must run units aren't reflected in resource plans. So I think that also is important consideration when even talking about the generation, dispatch, and resource assumptions. And then again, transmission assumptions. I think all of us are aware that as transmission projects, they experience delays, they experience various things throughout the year, and as well as known outages. And so it's important to make sure that those things are accounted for appropriately in the assumptions in order to do a short-term transmission study. And then out of that, again, you are able to identify what is the amount of capacity that's needed to be reserved for native load, while then also providing open access for anything that may remain. And so again, short-term process. I know some of the challenges. I can imagine one of the difficulties with this particular process might be because once you start tinkering with the assumptions, now you have to start considering what process do we actually need to have in place so that we can, in a timely fashion, evaluate, ensure that those outcomes and results are consistent with what we're expecting, and then have a reservation process that allows people to access it. So with that being said, I think that is it. This is our final slide. Again, thank you to the ISO as well as to my esteemed colleagues, but are there any questions?
We do have a question in queue, actually, Tyrone. It's Steve Greenleaf. Steve, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Great. Steve Greenleaf, Brookfield Renewable. Couple quick questions, and thank you, Tyrone, and the rest of the LSEs for putting this together. I was just trying to think through in some of your earlier slides and kind of the standard methodology, to calculate the native load obligations and whatnot. Just if you guys had thought about it in terms of the application of that in a day-ahead market enhancements or DAME or EDAM context. And it just occurred to me, for example, in the DAME context, with the CAISO's proposed introduction of imbalance reserves, which potentially, of course, could be provided by, intertie resources, whether you kind of saw that falling in the bucket of CBM or TRM, i.e. reserving capacity to be able to obtain imbalance reserves, from outside entities. And then I guess in the EDAM context, it's not perfectly clear to me how the EDAM buckets of transmission, the bucket 1, bucket 2, bucket 3, potentially impact any of these calculations. And maybe this is, it's too speculative at this point, but it occurred to me that kind of transmission coming in and out, being, for example, I may have the bucket wrong, bucket 3, where somebody's offering transmission in, how that gets factored into kind of a dynamic calculation. And then lastly, and sorry for kind of piling on here, but with respect to, you talked about potentially reserving transmission, once again, in the CBM TRM context, to get access to the hubs. And I guess, and I see Kathy's on, and I thought in the context of Idaho, certainly I thought reserve transmission on some of the, its major constrained interfaces to, to cover certain specific contingencies. And I'm wondering if the LSDs were thinking of it in the same context of, i.e., loss of a unit at PV, or whatnot. And maybe this is also a question for the CAISO is, do we do that? Does the CAISO do that today as far as kind of preserving some capacity on the interties to cover specific contingency? Quite honestly, I just don't remember. So anyway, sorry for the long list of questions or thoughts, but appreciate any feedback you can provide.
Absolutely. No, thank you. Thank you for those questions. I will say, and I'll look to some of my colleagues as well as if they want to add additional context and color. But my understanding, as you were talking about the imbalanced reserve product for the day ahead market enhancements, that is that's to address some of the load uncertainties between the day ahead and the real time market. But my understanding of the CBM is that is to meet some specific NERC requirements and NERC guidelines as it relates to, I think, what is it, mod 29 or mod 8, mod 4, one of those. And so I'm not necessarily sure if they directly overlap in the way that you might have mentioned in your thoughts or comments. But then the other part too, in terms of what the ISO does, I'll maybe pause and let them respond to that.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. This is Milos. Maybe I can touch on a little bit on that aspect. So CBM, I think there are specific NERC standards that dictate under, CBM, I think under those NERC standards can only be utilized for reserving transmission capacity and firm transmission capacity, and that capacity can only be utilized to deliver essentially imports in an EEA 2 or higher, so in an energy emergency level 2 or higher. So I think if today the CAISO doesn't calculate a capacity benefit margin, if we were to do that, it would be setting aside transmission capacity to be delivered, to be used only in an EEA 2 or higher emergency. Now, NERC standards also, I think, identify certain types of studies that could be utilized to support identifying the amount of capacity benefit margin, whether that's, I think, loss of load, loss of generation. I can't recall if Idaho did it based on a loss of generation or loss of load, but I know that ultimately they do calculate a CBM and they set aside transmission across different tie points to bring in imports that can be utilized in those EEA 2 or higher. But there's a specific NERC standard and there's a specific trigger ultimately for utilization of this transmission capacity that is set aside at CBM. And I think what we heard from entities, both in the context of CBM and the TRM, is that while I think Idaho has a CBM and SRP doesn't have a CBM, but they have a transmission reliability margin that they set aside firm transmission capacity. That firm transmission capacity in their systems is released as non-firm. And ultimately, if the occasion arises to utilize that transmission capacity, that transmission capacity, firm transmission capacity, has already been set aside. And if the path is overscheduled or is scheduled up to the limit and you need to bring in generation under either one of those margins, it may require curtailment of non-firm transactions to make that space available because the firm transmission has been set aside. But all that to say, there's specific NERC standards that dictate when you can use that CBM and provide guidance on how you derive that amount, what type of studies, as well as the CAISO does not currently calculate a capacity benefit margin. So hopefully that helps on that question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you, Milos and Tyrone. And I guess the reason I asked it, and once again, I may not recall this exactly right, but I thought in Bonneville's presentation they exercised some discretion within the NERC framework on how they implemented certain things. And I was just, I think going forward, I'm just curious whether the CAISO felt they had an ability to exercise some discretion. And maybe the NERC requirements are too constraining, so, you really couldn't. But so that was kind of the genesis of my question, was trying to figure out, was there some flexibility there? And does the CAISO, because obviously it's uniquely situated in its market structure, whether it was thinking in terms of fitting things into that box in a way that fit its market structure. But anyway, I don't want to belabor this.
No, great question. And I think, I think we've got time, so I do want to respond to that. I think what we also heard from BPA's presentation is that they did not have a capacity benefit margin. They did not feel the need to reserve that capacity benefit margin, which I think also was, if I remember, SRP as well. They did not have a capacity benefit margin, but they had a transmission reliability margin when they set aside firm transmission capacity. And I think when we talked through that discussion in their presentations, ultimately what it came down to is that they felt comfortable that they were setting aside sufficient transmission capacity for serving load under different conditions as an existing commitment, and that they also felt that they had it based on the assumptions and the level of conservative nature of some of those assumptions, both in the ETC component and maybe the TRM component, that they did not feel the need to also set aside transmission as a CBM. So I think there's the ability to have a CBM. Doesn't necessarily mean that every entity needs to have a CBM, but I think it also ultimately comes down to how do all of these different pieces come together, and are the assumptions in some of the different components of the methodology robust enough to account for different scenarios and different occurrences that maybe it would not necessitate that you have a CBM or that you account for other certain aspects in TRM. So I think ultimately it will come, how do all these three pieces fit together? The ETC calculation, existing transmission commitments, and are those assumptions robust enough to account for different types of scenarios and contingencies such that you may not need some of the other margins? Or, do you kind of split the transmission capacity across all three of those components based on, again, the assumptions that you ultimately utilize? If you're conservative, for example, in your ETC calculation, you may not need, some aspects of the other margins. But if you're not as conservative in those components, then you may need a capacity benefit margin. I think ultimately that's the discretion I think that we heard in those discussions that each of the entities have, and ultimately how do they determine how much to set aside and how comfortable they feel that they've accounted for the different contingencies and scenarios in serving load and maintaining reliability.
Hey, Milos, this is Tyrone. Just two quick things that I think you said that I think are especially important. One, and it also goes back, I think it was Steve's one of his original thoughts as well, in terms of the overlap with DAME and EDAM. And I think that's also one of the things that a part of this process is seeing how these activities and how these potential decisions are interplaying and overlapping with those other initiatives. And then the second thing to kind of maybe double click on some of the parts that you also mentioned as well, Milos, as it relates to the assumptions. And I think there are definitely some unique assumptions specifically for the ISO when you start to consider the amount of storage that the ISO is bringing on and the amount of intermittent resources that are currently operating within the market. Those are all factors. And then also, I mean, I'm also thinking of the fact I saw my sink was on here at my house, and I was telling my kids, make sure you turn the water off, and reminding just as a reminder, we're in a significant drought. So the impact to even the hydro decisions. And so when you start to look at all of those things and all those assumptions, I think even if you start to say, hey, traditionally CBM or TRM might not have been used, or they might not be used in these other entities, when you start to take into consideration some of those factors, you may result in some different outcomes where one might want to do something a little bit different in order to preserve reliability.
Anyway, thank you all. I mean, it's all very helpful. And I guess one final thought, Milos, can you remind me on the kind of parallel paths we're on in this initiative, which, I think the intent had the long-term reservation process in place in 2024. How does that align with EDAM and DAME right now as far as just, I guess, the policy milestones?
Yeah, and I think, thanks for that. And I think you'll see that in the paper that will come out today. We have an updated timeline for phase 2 as well, where we're going to be looking at essentially targeting a draft final proposal on this in the August timeframe of this year, kind of concurrently as we're going through some of the other initiatives as well, so that we can evaluate those implications and interdependencies between the initiatives. That's, I think, ultimately the level of complexity here of the transmission reservation process that we develop and the different types of products and different decisions that we make, those have different implications for EDAM and DAME. And so I think ultimately all of these things will be looking to be addressed kind of in parallel and identifying those interdependencies as we evolve what this transmission reservation process looks like.
Okay. Thank you very much to both of you for the responses.
Hi, this is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Is this a good time to jump in?
Absolutely.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, I
Great,
think we have
thank you.
Chris.
What was that? Sorry, Milosh.
No, yeah, I think you can go ahead, and I think we have Chris Devon afterwards.
Okay, sorry about that, Chris. Sorry to jump ahead of you. I just had a quick kind of thinking about next steps. And actually, can we move back to slide 7, please? Because I do, I think the long-term and the short-term breakdown for kind of the native load and NITs, which I'll do some work on that and talk with Tyrone and the group more. The CBM and TRM is going to need a similar framework. And we definitely agree that Appendix L is a place to start. CAISO's already identified some reasonable reasons for TRM and also CBM approach. I think that's the right place to start. I think the devil in the detail is when you're talking about, right now those are hourly, even those proposals are for hourly. I understand the CBM is not calculated, but the value, the rules themselves are in the appendix. And what we need to think about is how those risks change, or how we think about those values moving from an hourly to a daily, a weekly, monthly, and annual estimate for these values. I think to help with that exploration, and this is one that it would be really great if the CAISO's engineers could present at the next meeting on what these rules are, how these set-asides would work based on current rules, and any reflections or thoughts about changing the time periods of them, like I said, from hourly to daily, weekly, monthly, and annual, as a few examples. So I just wanted to ask if the CAISO could please do that at the next meeting.
Thanks, Kathleen. I think we can consider that. I think this is broader than just the CBM theorem. I think that's a question for practically every component of this methodology, which is how do you derive that amount across those different time frames. So I don't know that it's unique for the CBM, and the CBM, there's specific NERC standards that lay that out.
Well, maybe I can clarify the distinction I'm making. I'm not necessarily suggesting you spend a lot of time on what should happen. I think that is something that the CAISO and you will do in your proposal phase. I'm suggesting that talking about the current tariff and the current calculation, your CBM section already has information there. So does your TRM. Level setting on that would be very useful. Decisions on compliance, CAISO was directed back on the open access orders to create a formula for CBM, even though the CAISO did not at the time choose to implement a solution under those orders that would actually calculate it. But so the framework itself is there, and there is historical significance and I think value in going through what we have today in the ATC calculation, what the principles were for getting there, as well as like TR, and I'm saying CBM and TRM because this is the level of detail of what we're doing today that I think we would largely want to start with and expand on, and or what our rules are today. I'm not suggesting that it be a proposal from the CAISO on how you would calculate all elements of the formula. I'm hoping that we'll have chances to iterate on the LSE's framework that they put forward today. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathleen.
All right. So we're going to move to the next caller who has the hand raised in queue, and that is Chris Devon. You may go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Very good. Yeah, this is Chris Evans, Customized Energy Solutions. Thanks for the opportunity, and I did want to thank the IOUs or the joint LSCs and Tyrone and everyone that worked on this for the presentation and starting to think about how these concepts can translate to a proposal here, and Milos as well for doing such a great job on all this. Wrangling all these ideas and starting to get these thoughts together, and those responses you provided earlier to Steve's questions. I actually had a lot of similar questions that Steve mentioned, so I won't repeat all that, but I thought that was really good input and reaction, so that was very helpful. I just think my kind of reaction to all this personally is that it seems like this is a good start here, but again, the details are really what's going to matter. So I would like to see this built out a little bit more, obviously, and this is a good first start. Some of the stuff that I was interested in was kind of related to the idea of the CBM and potentially how that relates to possible like reserve sharing arrangements with other BAs, and maybe that could be part of the discussion as well. I know that CAISA doesn't necessarily have formalized reserve sharing agreements, but it's always kind of been a background discussion in some of these RA and other regionalization discussions. So something just to throw in there for further consideration as well. And then really, I think kind of just paralleling what Steve was mentioning earlier, I think the idea of how this is going to translate, to the current intertie market, and then the future in EDAM, I think is really the key that we need to try to formulate a little bit better as we move forward into a proposal. So just some thoughts and reactions here to the good initial presentation. Not really any question or anything, but just some additional thoughts to share. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And this is Milos. Just to note, good points, especially about the reserve sharing. I'll note that as part of the TRM, the transmission reliability margin, there's the second box there, explicitly as part of the NERC standards, reserve sharing requirements, any kind of transmission associated with reserve sharing is under those NERC standards. That's one component that could be, transmission could be set aside under the TRM. So I don't think it under those standards it necessarily fits on the CBM, but I think along your lines it fits somewhere in here. To the extent that that's needed, TRM is explicitly accounting for reserve sharing requirements under the NERC standards.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Milos. Actually, I forgot that aspect of it. But yeah, I think it kind of just speaks to your other earlier reaction, which is, related to how all this needs to fit together, and we need to, look at the bigger picture in the different time frames, like what Kathleen was mentioning as well. So good thoughts there. Thanks for the reaction.
Yeah.
All right. I do not see any additional questions in queue. I think there's something in the chat possibly, though.
I think it looks like there's a question from Dan Williams with CES in the chat that says, I may have missed this earlier. How does the ISO schedule in and out market purchases its operators make at the type points during emergencies? And would that be a use of CBM or TRM out of market? Yeah. I'll have to double check in terms of whether there's any kind of an explicit reliance on either of these margins. Like I said before, while we do have a formula for CBM, we do not set aside transmission for CBM. I think what happens is there's a consideration, is there available transmission space across the system to bring in those out-of-market purchases? And I'll have to double check some of the components of our current TRM. But ultimately, under the standards, the CBM could be utilized to bring in some of these imports in an EEA 2 or higher, energy emergency alert level 2 or higher. I think the NERC standard is fairly specific for the trigger Otherwise, the transmission reliability margin also does allow for setting aside a firm transmission for variation in generation dispatch assumptions, any kind of other kind of uncertainty that maybe need to be accounted for. And there's a list of those uncertainties that we'll need to consider as well as part of the TRM. But I think traditionally, CBM can be utilized for those import transactions, which I could see these being either out-of-market transactions or could be other offers that are in the market, whether they're RA or other imports, that if you have the CBM set aside, those could have a higher priority ultimately. And you may need to cut some lower priority transactions in order to allow imports to be delivered for using that firm transmission that's been set aside as CBM.
All right. It looks like there may be a addition to the question that Dan Williams had, but as a reminder, ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to enter the question queue, please press the raise hand icon, which is located above the chat panel. If you would like to ask a question via phone, please press pound.
And while we're waiting to see if there are other questions, this is Milos. I had a couple of comments and thoughts on my own for us to consider as well. And again, thank you, Tyrone, and the California LSCs for taking the time and putting this good presentation together of an overview of the framework. I think one of the things that, and I think a couple of you already noted that in your questions and comments, and I think Chris as well, when you were kind of suggesting maybe some more granular detail. I think, as Chris said, the devil will be in the details. One of the things that we will need to do is when we're looking at these calculations of the different components, particularly the calculation of transmission capacity that's needed to serve native load, is ultimately going to be in the assumptions. What are the appropriate generation assumptions that the ISO would utilize, both in the long-term time frame, 1 year or longer, as well as in the short-term time frames, less than 1 year. And a question for us is, do somehow those assumptions vary between the long-term time frame and the short-term time frame? For example, I think what we heard in other presentations was, I think it was in the context of the Idaho presentation, that while they utilize a 1 in 20 load forecast in the long-term ATC calculation, and then they utilize generation assumptions to serve that 1 in 20 load forecast. Ultimately, as you get closer in time, they would look at a more accurate forecast, for lack of a better term, or a more informed forecast in the month ahead time frame to ultimately determine, have we set aside enough transmission capacity, or is there transmission capacity that may need to, for example, be released in that time frame? But I think we'll need to do the same thing in our assessment, is looking at, in the longer term time frame, what's the appropriate level of the load forecast, and then similarly in the generation assumptions for calculating those native load needs, what are the appropriate generation assumptions? I think Tyrone touched on this a little bit, but I think what are the type of inputs that the ISO has that could inform those generation assumptions? It's in the longer term time frame and the shorter term time frame. There's resource adequacy plans, there's the IRP, there's historical generation dispatch and how resources have been dispatched to serve load that can inform what those generation assumptions should be, and is that different as you get a little bit closer in time? Can you inform those generation assumptions by some additional information? Could you rely on monthly array plans to a larger extent, and some other information as well? But those are the things that we'll need to consider as well. I'll note that in our benchmarking with the other ISOs and RTOs that had a transmission reservation process, and we noted some of this in the issue paper, in that matrix towards the end of the issue paper. I think PJM, MISO, and SPP that have a transmission reservation process, they essentially have the similar process and similar set-aside process as we've heard here from the Western entities and similar to the presentation that the California LLCs put together. For example, those 3 ISOs and RTOs in the generation assumptions, because they don't necessarily rely on imports significantly or as significantly as the ISO, what we've heard from discussions with them is that their generation assumptions are really based upon a historical look of how internal resources have performed in serving load. And so in calculating that existing transmission commitments component, their generation assumptions are informed by looking at data over the last year or two and really stacking resources, internal generation based on most reliable to least reliable, creating a generation stack effectively that looks at certain qualities of the resources. How often have they been on outage? And those that are least on outage are close to the top. Those that are dispatched most often, those are on top of that stack. And ultimately, that's the generation stack that they utilize and pair against the load forecast to determine the transmission capacity to set aside for serving native loads. As they get closer in time, they may incorporate some imports into those assumptions based on more informed information about whether some generation is available or not, outages, et cetera. But ultimately, in the long-term time frame, they're looking at how resources have historically been dispatched and performed to inform those generation assumptions. All this to say is that I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach to this. There's, I think, flexibility in how some of this is derived and the generation assumptions that are utilized. And it may vary upon, in our market, there are certain unique aspects of our market, and, we receive RA plans, but at the same time, there's the IRP, we can use some of this historical dispatch generation to inform how load is served. I think Tyrone touched on this as well, that while you may have RA plans, those resources may not be the ones that are ultimately dispatched to serve load, because those are offered into the market, but the market may dispatch, non-RA resources as well to serve load. So those are all the things we'll need to consider when determining those generation assumptions. And I think there's what we've heard based from the ISOs and RTOs, as well from the BPA, SRP, and Idaho Power. There's some of these aspects are unique to the individual system, the unique characteristics of that system, the unique load aspects of that system, unique market aspects of that system that we'll need to consider. And I guess the theme here, again, is not one size fits all, but I think there's a number of inputs and aspects that we can consider when ultimately determining the different assumptions, both in the generation side as well as the load side. So I'll pause there and see if there are any if this gave a little bit of time to folks to formulate questions or thoughts, or any aspects that I think this is a good opportunity as well to raise for the ISO. Any thoughts, any perspectives, any other aspects that we should consider when ultimately identifying a proposal for how to derive some of these elements.
All right. We do have a few questions in queue. Steve, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Thanks, Milos. Steve Greenlee, Brookfield Renewable again. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. One quick question, and I guess kind of going forward suggestion, I'm curious about the relationship between, these calculations and any impact they may have on the MIC calculation and allocation process. And, I appreciate MIC as, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I interpret MIC, it's an import RA accounting convention, really kind of issue as opposed to a transmission reservation. But it would seem to me there would be potentially some crossover here. So any going forward, it'd be nice to get the CAISO's view, or the LSC's view for that matter, on kind of the impacts. And part of it actually also goes to kind of the incentive structures under MIC, because I know over the years there's been at least concerns raised or assertions raised about, the MIC with, based on a load ratio share allocation, the IOUs or the larger LSCs, I should say, potentially, preserving or reserving MIC to cover RAIM exposure and whatnot. So I'm wondering if there's a kind of an incentive here also in that context. That could be a uninformed question, but I throw it out there. It just occurred to me that, what are the implications on MIC? So anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. This is Milos again. That's a good point and something that we're considering as well. What are the potential implications here of MIC, if any, of this process? And when you set aside transmission capacity as an existing commitment for native load needs, its relationship to MIC. So great point, great suggestion.
Okay, thanks.
All right, we are moving to the next question in queue. Dan, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hey, Milos, Dan from Customized Energy Solutions. Just filling in a few more blanks on that thought around the out-of-market purchases and any relation to CBM, TRM there. And that's just that the last time that I heard it discussed was around the recap of the July 9th activity. And that's in the summer market performance report for July this past year. And it looks like during the kind of over the evening peak after the D-rates had happened on the COI and at NOB, CAISO was pulling in like, I think 200 to 300 megawatts of out-of-market purchases while in that EEA 2-3 stance. And I think in that instance, definitely with the amount of curtailment of exports that was going on, we were probably nowhere near the limits on imports from a intertie constraint perspective. But I think just maybe having more discussion of whether, when looking at it on a longer term perspective, whether that's a potential driver for identifying CBM or TRM needs. Just think it'd be good to have a little bit more discussion there, even if on some of these specific times where it's been used, we're not anywhere near the intertie limits anyway.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it. Yeah, we'll look into that, and I think that will be part of the consideration as well. Ultimately, within this broader scope of items, what ultimately fits into that TRM and CBM. We do have like I said earlier, I think we have a TRM. I just have to go back and check the different components of it that we do ultimately set aside in that daily and the hourly time frames. So.
Yeah, and I think as the comment was made earlier, if there's not explicit reserve sharing going on, that in some ways, I kind of view that out-of-market purchases as some version of that, because it's going out and kind of selecting capacity that the market optimization didn't select, but is made available by others within the region to help from a system reliability perspective.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan.
All right. I do not see any additional questions in queue at this time.
Maybe we'll do one more call and see if anybody has any other thoughts or suggestions or things here to keep in mind based on this presentation. Hopefully it spurred some. I appreciate the discussion that it spurred, this discussion, the presentation from the California LSCs. I think it definitely provides a framework that's consistent with what we've heard from the other presenters across the Western interconnection, and it's certainly consistent in our experience with the framework that the other ISOs and RTOs have in place, the SPP, PJM, and MISO. So I think from CAISO's perspective, I think this is definitely a consistent framework with everything that we've heard, and the ISO again has similar ATC methodologies that today and this is what spurred the entire discussion, is that today the ISO does not explicitly account for native load needs as part of the existing transmission commitments. The existing transmission commitments of the ATC methodology that the CAISO uses really just focuses on essentially existing transmission contracts that are in place, but there's not an explicit accounting for transmission capacity for native load needs. And so as we delve into identifying those native load needs as part of that methodology and the other existing commitments, we will also be looking at the CBM and the TRM components and the propriety of those as part of the overall proposal. Any more questions? Let's give it maybe 5 more seconds, see if anybody jumps in. Okay. If there are no more questions, again, let me just extend the gratitude on behalf of the ISO to the California LSC, to you, Tyrone, for walking us through this and for taking the time to put this together. We certainly appreciate it and appreciate the time you took. And we appreciate everybody, joining us, hopefully, through all of these initial sessions, and you had an opportunity to hear from the other 3 entities, BPA, Idaho, and SRP, on their practices. And hopefully some of this is starting to come together, at least, and we're all starting to congregate around commonality in terms and concepts. Now the challenge will be, obviously, is the details of the different inputs and the assumptions that go into the different components of this methodology to derive those native load needs and to identify potentially the CBM and the TRM as well. So we certainly appreciate everybody that's been with us throughout this discussion. Go ahead, Keone.
This is Keone. Generally, we have a next step slide, and I'm not seeing that here, so do you want to go over that? I know this is going to the EIM governing body in March, and along with the Board of Governors in March. Do you have anything else you want to add in terms of next steps?
Thank you. I was building to that. Appreciate you, Keone, jumping in. Let me some of the dates that you noted are not accurate. This is focused on phase 2. So let me just wrap up. And again, thank the California LSCs. The next steps here will be if any stakeholders, and I know Kathleen, you wanted to have some time to work through the presentation as well and provide edits. If there are any stakeholders that would like to further present any suggestions, ideas, or concepts within this working group 1 topic, please do send us a note, and we can schedule additional working group 1 meetings on this. And if you have any other suggestions for topics to be covered within working group 1. As I noted at the beginning, we will be scheduling and we'll be announcing working groups 2 and 3 meetings next week. A number of stakeholders in response to the issue paper suggested that we start off with the native load concept and discussion, get grounded on that, and then move to the other working groups. So you should see the invites for the other working groups. We're just coordinating on presenters. We do want to start the discussion similar to how we started this working group 1, which is with initial presentations from the external entities on their practices, different transmission products, but also the process for resuming transmission service and how they ultimately evaluate requests for transmission service to give us a good grounding. And then we can move into that discussion of part of working group 2 of what type of transmission products would make sense for the ISO to have and the different nuances of those. And then working group 3 will focus on the system expansion and integration with our planning process and potentially driving upgrade to the extent that parties want to reserve long-term transmission service to establish that higher scheduling priority. What does that process look like, and how does it integrate with our planning process? So those should be coming out next week, and like I said at the beginning, I think we will be looking to start those in January. They will be throughout the different, there will not be necessarily in a set particular cadence, but I think we'll be looking to fit those in with the availability of different participants. So, I think we'll have 3 or 4 different meetings throughout that month on these topics, fitting it in between. We recognize there's a number of other things going on, including the EDAM stakeholder working groups. So fitting these in where we can to allow time for stakeholders to congregate. I will note that, and I haven't, since I've been in this meeting, I haven't seen if we've posted it yet. But like I said at the beginning, we posted the phase 1, or we will be posting the phase 1 proposal later today. and then this is focused on phase 2 of the initiative that has a longer runway. And as I noted at the beginning, in that phase 1 proposal, we'll be sharing an updated timeline on phase 2 that's going to be looking at an August 2022 draft final proposal date, and then working backwards from that, we have some more specific dates on more near-term milestones. So let me pause here and just see if there are any more questions before we adjourn.
All right, I do not see any questions in queue currently. But remember, ladies and gentlemen, press the raise hand icon above the chat box if you would like to jump into the question queue. And if you're on the phone, #2 will enter you as well.
Hello, this is Keone. The draft final proposal has been posted to the website, and we'll be updating the website as well with the correct EIM governing body and board of governors dates up there right now. If March is not the month, then that'll be corrected.
Thanks, Keone. And again, Keone, you're referring to phase 1 of the proposal that we posted. We will be posting. This is focused on phase 2 of the initiative. And that in that phase 1, there will be a specific timeline associated with phase 2. Okay. If there are no more questions, thanks everybody for taking the time. We really appreciate it. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions, but be on the lookout for working group 2 and 3 dates coming out next week. If anybody has any additional suggestions on topics they want to talk about, part of working group 1, let us know. We'll schedule an additional session of the working group. Have a great day, everybody. Have a great weekend, and we'll be in touch. Thank you, everybody.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.